Montana Territory, June of 1883. The sun beat down hard on the small town of Red Horizon, where a white clapboard church stood at the edge of Main Street, its steeple piercing the blue sky like a blade. Inside, the air was thick with heat and whispers. Every pew was filled. Folks fanned themselves with their hats or folded handbills, eyes darting toward the front where a young woman stood alone, hands trembling against her white lace dress, her chest rising and falling too fast. Her name was Savannah Ames. She was 22, born and raised on a cattle spread 20 miles south of town, and everyone in Red Horizon knew her heart had always been too soft and too loyal. She had waited 5 years for Everett Dawson to propose. She had sewn her own wedding dress, piece by piece. And now the church clock had struck noon and Everett was nowhere. The preacher cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Savannah's father sat frozen in the front pew, his weathered hat in his lap, while her mother stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Savannah's eyes searched the back of the church again, hoping, praying. But no one came through the doors. Then the silence broke. A man stood up from the back row, tall and broad-shouldered, with a sun-creased face and clear gray eyes. A wide-brimmed hat hung in his hand, pressed tight to his chest. He wore a clean-buttoned shirt, dust still clinging to his boots. "Marry me instead," he said, his voice steady and deep. Gasps rippled through the room. Savannah turned slowly. Her vision blurred as she tried to make sense of the man walking down the aisle toward her. His name was Thayer Locke. She knew him barely. They had spoken twice in 5 years. He was a rancher west of town, quiet, kept to himself, honest as the day was long. He had come to buy feed from her father once and had tipped his hat to her on the street maybe 3 times since. That was it, but he was here. He had stepped forward, he stopped in front of her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You should not be standing there alone," he said, voice low. "You deserve better than that coward." Savannah could not speak, her lips parted, but no sound came. "I know it is sudden," Thayer added, "but I mean every word. If you want to leave, I will take you. If you want to marry today, I will stand beside you." Tears welled in her eyes. Her hands curled into fists. "Why would you do that?" she whispered. "You do not even know me." Thayer's gaze softened. He reached out, slow, careful, and gently touched her arm. "I have watched you carry yourself with grace in the hardest season of your life. I have watched you ride out storms your family faced, never crumbling. I may not know everything, but I know your heart. That is enough." The church was dead quiet now. Savannah looked back at her father, who gave the smallest nod, eyes shining. Her mother clutched her handkerchief, unable to speak. Savannah exhaled, long and shaky. She looked back into Thayer's eyes. "All right," she said softly. "Yes," the preacher blinked, confused. "You mean to go through with the ceremony?" She nodded. "Yes." "With him?" And so, with the same bouquet in her hands and the same vows waiting in the preacher's worn Bible, Savannah Ames married Thayer Locke as the whole town watched, stunned. Afterward, they stepped out into the bright light of the afternoon, husband and wife. Her white dress fluttered in the wind. She still looked like she might faint. Thayer helped her down the steps, his hand never leaving hers. He guided her to his wagon, where a sturdy bay horse waited patiently. "You all right?" he asked once they were out of earshot from the crowd. "No," she said honestly, "but I will be." He gave a quiet nod and helped her up into the wagon seat. He climbed in beside her, flicked the reins, and they rolled out of Red Horizon, the sun warm on their backs, the town shrinking behind them. They rode in silence for some time, the wheels creaking over dirt and the wind rustling through the cottonwoods. Savannah kept her eyes on the road ahead, her heart still pounded. "Where are we going?" she asked finally. "My place," Thayer said. "It is a small spread by the river, quiet." "No one will bother you there," she nodded. "You live alone?" "I do." They continued on. The mountains rose in the distance and the land stretched out in golden waves. "What about you?" Thayer asked gently. "Were you in love with him?" Savannah looked down at her hands. "I thought I was. Maybe I was just in love with the idea of him. I do not know any more." Thayer did not push. He just drove. By the time they reached his homestead, a single-story cabin with a porch and a small barn, the sun was dipping low. He helped her down, showed her inside. The place was clean, simple. There was a quilt on the bed and a kettle on the stove. "I will sleep in the loft," he said. "You can have the room. I know this is not what you expected." "No," Savannah said, her voice thin, "but you have been kind." "More than I deserved." He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his eyes shifted. "You deserved better than him, and you deserve someone who will stay." That night, Savannah sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the window where the stars blinked through the dark. She could not sleep. Her heart felt torn in half, one side aching with shame and betrayal, the other uncertain but strangely calm. She remembered the way Thayer had looked at her, not with pity but with something steadier, solid. She rose and opened the door to the loft ladder. "Thayer," she whispered. He leaned over the edge of the loft, still fully dressed, his hair tousled. "Yeah, thank you," he nodded once. "You are welcome." She stood there a moment longer, unsure what else to say, then she climbed back into bed and pulled the quilt around her. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. Inside, her breathing slowed, and somewhere, deep in her chest, a new beginning stirred, quiet but real. The first morning came quiet and gray, with low clouds pressing down on the land like a held breath. Savannah rose early, more out of habit than rest. Her dress from yesterday hung on a nail near the door, creased and spotted with dust from the wagon ride. She left it there and reached for a plain calico gown folded neatly on a chest beside the bed. It wasn't hers, but it had been washed and mended by someone who cared about keeping things right. She ran her fingers along the seams before pulling it over her head. When she stepped outside, the air was sharp with the scent of river grass and damp earth. The barn door stood open. She followed the soft clang of metal and the low murmur of a man's voice. Thayer was inside, brushing down the bay horse. He didn't look up when she entered. "You always talk to your animals like that?" she asked. He glanced over his shoulder, then nodded once. "They listen better than most men." She crossed her arms loosely. "I can believe that." He finished with the brush, set it down, and checked the animal's hooves without another word. She watched the way he moved, efficient, sure, no wasted effort. When he finally turned toward her, there was a fleck of hay caught in his sleeve. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. "I'll be in after this." "I'll pour you a cup." She left him to his work. Inside, the cabin held a deep stillness broken only by the soft hiss of the kettle. She found 2 tin cups and set them on the table. By the time he stepped in, the warmth had eased some of the morning's chill. He shrugged off his coat and sat across from her without ceremony. "You sure you're all right?" he asked, lifting the cup. She stared into hers, the steam curling up into her face. "I'm not sure what I am yet. I can give you space." "I don't think that's what I need." His brow creased, but he didn't speak. "Everyone saw," she went on. "They all know. I can't just go back to town and pretend I'm not different now." "You're not," he said simply. She looked up, startled. "You're not different," he said again. "What happened to you, what he did, doesn't change what kind of woman you are, doesn't lessen you." She gripped the cup tighter. "You don't know what kind I am," he nodded once. "That's true, but I plan to find out." They didn't speak for a while after that. The wind shifted outside, brushing against the windows with a low sigh. Later, she stepped out to the small patch of garden behind the house. Rows of beans and squash sprouted in neat lines, the soil dark and well tended. She knelt and worked quietly, pulling weeds with careful hands. Thayer approached as the sun broke through the clouds. He leaned on the fence, arms folded, watching her work. "You ever kept a garden?" she asked without looking up. "No," he said, "but I helped my ma with hers till I was 16. Savannah brushed dirt from her fingers. "I had one back home. Wild onions, mostly. We had a dry patch, nothing much took root." He nodded slowly. "You can have this one if you want it." She looked up. "You'd let me? I married you, didn't I? That ought to mean something." Her gaze held his for a long moment. Then she stood, wiped her hands on her skirt, and nodded once. "All right then." The day stretched on. She found the rhythm of the place, how the chickens pecked near the coop just before dusk, how the creek behind the barn hummed low after the sun dipped. She swept the floors, folded linens that had sat untouched, and boiled beans for supper. He came in at twilight, his shirt damp from hauling water. She handed him a bowl without a word. They ate by lamplight, the room silent but not strained. When the meal was done, she gathered the dishes. Thayer stepped in beside her at the wash basin. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know," he replied, rolling up his sleeves. They washed in tandem. The quiet between them began to feel less like a void and more like a kind of trust. When the last plate was dried, she turned to him. "Why did you really do it?" He didn't pretend not to understand her. "I saw you standing alone," he said. "And I thought if I let you leave that church without someone at your side, I'd carry that regret longer than I could stand." She studied him, trying to find cracks in the answer. There were none. "Would you have said something if he had shown up?" she asked. He shook his head. "No. But I would have hated myself for it." She stepped back, the truth heavy in her chest. "You don't owe me anything, Thayer." "I know I don't, but I want to." She didn't speak again that night. When she climbed the ladder to the loft, he didn't follow. He lit the lantern, set it low, and left it burning on the table in case she woke needing the light. In the dark above, Savannah lay beneath a borrowed quilt, listening to the quiet movements below. She no longer felt like a ghost of someone else's story. She was beginning to feel like herself again, but different. Someone new, someone just beginning to be known, and for the first time in days her chest didn't ache. The summer deepened. Days settled into a rhythm measured, steady, unspoken. Savannah rose early, fed the chickens, gathered eggs in her apron, and walked the line of young vegetables that had begun to climb with quiet promise. Thayer was out before her most days, mending fence or working the cattle trail that curved along the edge of his property. They spoke little in the mornings, but something passed between them in glances and gestures, a kind of growing ease. One afternoon, near the end of July, a wagon rattled up the long stretch of road toward the cabin. Savannah was on the porch, sewing a tear in one of Thayer's shirts. She stood as it drew near, her heart climbing into her throat. The driver pulled the reins, dust settling around the wheels, and a woman stepped down, older, with a straight back and a wide-brimmed bonnet tied snug beneath her chin. "Mrs. Locke?" the woman asked. Savannah blinked. "Yes," the woman offered, a faint smile. "Name's Ruth Lanning. I help run the dry goods in Red Horizon. Heard you were out here now, thought you might need some things." Savannah stepped forward slowly. "That's kind of you." "Not kindness," Ruth said, lifting a crate from the wagon herself. "Just sense. A woman can't run a home with scraps and a flour sack. I brought candles, soap, some cloth, and a few other items. Paid for by someone who didn't want their name known. I can't accept what I didn't earn." "You can," Ruth said firmly, "when it's given with care, not pity." Savannah hesitated, then reached for the crate. "Thank you." As Ruth climbed back into the wagon, she paused. "I was at the church that day. Folks in town talk, but not all of us are fools. The way that man looked at you, your husband, I've seen that kind of look before. You're not alone, Mrs. Locke, not now." Savannah watched her ride off, the wheels kicking up dust again, then carried the crate inside. She unpacked its slowly, jar candles, a spool of blue thread, a bar of lye soap wrapped in linen. Beneath it all, a slim book of poetry, the pages worn from someone else's hands. She ran her fingers over the binding without opening it. That night she waited until Thayer had finished feeding the stock and wiping down the tack. She met him by the pump as he rinsed his arms. "Someone brought supplies today," she said. "I saw the wagon," he replied, shaking water from his hands. "They brought more than we need." He dried his forearms on a rag. "Then we'll share what we can't use." She studied him in the fading light. "You didn't ask for this, any of it." He looked toward the barn, voice quiet. "That doesn't mean I don't want it." She stepped closer, the hem of her skirt brushing his boots. "You hardly know me. I know you stay calm when things go sideways. I know your hands are steady. I know you didn't cry when he left you. And I know you've been kind to me when you didn't have reason to be." She looked down. "That's not the same as love." "No," he said after a long pause, "but it could be the beginning of it." They stood there, the wind tugging gently at the trees, until she nodded once and turned inside. She left the door open behind her. The following week brought a harder wind, dry and restless. A storm broke one afternoon as Thayer was returning from checking the stream bed. Savannah was hauling firewood under the lean-to when the first cracks split the air. Rain followed fast, thick and cold. Thayer found her stacking the last of the kindling, soaked to her elbows. You should have gone inside, he said, taking the bundle from her arms and setting it down. I wasn't finished. You're trembling. She looked up at him, rain threading her hair to her cheeks. You don't have to fix everything. He didn't answer at first, then quieter, I know. She turned toward the house, but he caught her wrist gently. Savannah, she stilled. Are you afraid of me? The question hung between them, sudden and unadorned. No, she said after a quiet beat. I'm afraid of trusting the wrong man twice. His fingers released hers slowly. That's fair. They stepped inside together, dripping onto the floorboards. She changed in the bedroom while he lit the stove. When she returned, he had set her sewing basket near the fire and was drying his shirt by the hearth. She sank into the rocker without speaking. Later that night, he brought her the book of poems she'd set aside. He didn't ask about it, just placed it on the table with a nod. She opened it after he'd gone to the loft. The first page bore a name in faded ink, To Leela for the Long Days. She read until her eyes grew heavy, the lantern flickering low. The words curled into her like threads, soft and careful. The next morning, she left the book open on the table where he'd see it. From then on, things shifted just a little. He carved her a spoon from river maple. She mended the frayed lining of his coat without being asked. They didn't speak of feelings, of promises, or of what might come. But something was growing between them, not sudden, not loud, but enduring. And when he handed her a small tin of honeycomb from a neighbor's trade and said simply, "Thought you'd like it," she smiled without hesitation. It was not love yet. But it was the shape of love, rising slow and strong like a stream after long drought. The first frost came early that year, scraping silver over the fields before the cottonwoods had finished shedding their leaves. Savannah stood on the porch just after dawn, a shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, watching the mist rise off the river bend in slow spirals. From the barn came the hollow ring of a hammer, steady and paced. She didn't move toward it. She liked to listen before stepping into the noise of the day. The roof had started to leak in the back corner near the stove. Thayer had said it would hold until next thaw, but she'd seen the crease in his brow when he checked it. She knew he'd fix it before snow came, whether he said so or not. She filled the kettle and stoked the fire. The warmth crept in slow as she waited for it to boil. On the shelf above the washbasin rested a pair of pine figurines, simple, rough cut. She hadn't seen him carve them, but she'd found them left without mention. One stood with a wide-brimmed hat, the other with a braid etched down the back. She turned when the door opened. "You're soaked through," she said. "You didn't wear your coat." He stepped inside, hat in hand, shoulders damp. "It's hanging by the tack wall. I didn't want to drag the mud in." "You'll catch cold," he shrugged. "I've had worse." Savannah poured water into a basin and reached for a towel. "Sit. You're dripping on the floor." He obeyed without protest, his boots heavy on the boards. She knelt beside him, dabbing the chilled skin at the back of his neck, the curve of his jaw. His eyes stayed on her hands. "Why haven't you asked me what I want?" she said, wringing the cloth. He hesitated. "Because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." "I think I'm ready now." She sat back on her heels, the cloth hanging limp between her fingers. "I want to stay," she said, "not because I have nowhere else. Not because I was left standing in front of strangers, but because I've found quiet here, the kind that doesn't press or demand." He looked at her then, slow and steady. "And what do you want from me?" "Nothing you haven't already given." He reached forward, took the cloth from her hand, and set it aside. "You don't owe me gentleness, Savannah, but I'll give it to you as long as you let me." She stood, her knees stiff, and walked to the window. The sky had cleared, pale and sharp. She pressed her palm to the glass for a long moment before speaking. "I want to plant fruit trees come spring. Peach, maybe, something that roots deep." He stepped behind her, his voice low. "We'll dig the holes together." She turned, and he didn't move. The space between them had shrunk to nothing. "I've never been kissed by someone who meant it," she said plainly. He didn't reach for her. He waited. She stepped to him, hands light on his chest. "I'd like to change that." His mouth met hers like a promise, unhurried, certain, warm despite the cold seeping through the window panes. She breathed in, steadied herself against him, and felt the last of the hurt loosen from her ribs. When they parted, she smiled without effort. That evening, Thayer brought indoor wood without being asked. She lit the lamp before he returned, and he found her seated at the table, darning a torn cuff. He paused in the doorway, his arms full of kindling. "I thought we might make a new table come winter," he said. "This one's served, but the legs wobble." She set her needle aside. "If I help, it'll wobble worse." He grinned, the expression easy. "You can measure twice, I'll cut once." Outside, the wind had lost its sting. The sky held more stars than clouds. She watched him stack the firewood in the corner, his movements familiar now, worn into the shape of home. And for the first time in her remembering, Savannah felt no need to run from silence. It was enough to be here. Enough to know the door need never close between them. The snow arrived slow and steady, veiling the land in silence. By mid-December, the fields had vanished beneath a white sheet, and the river ran slower, its surface edged with ice. The days shortened, and the hearth became the heart of the house. Savannah took to baking in the afternoons, filling the cabin with the smell of molasses and warm cornmeal. One morning, Thayer brought in a narrow fir from the ridge. He shook the snow off its limbs and set it near the window without a word. Savannah looked up from the bread dough, wiping her hands on her apron. "Didn't take you for a man who marked the season." "I never did before," he said, "but it's different now." She watched him trim the lower branches with his knife, careful and slow. "Did you have much of a Christmas growing up?" "Not really. My pa didn't keep track of days unless it had to do with cattle. Ma used to sew a new handkerchief for each of us if she had the scraps." Savannah nodded. "We never had much either. But Mama once strung cranberries and hung them over the window, said it made the winter feel less empty." That afternoon, she boiled a pot of berries and threaded them onto twine with a needle, her fingers red by the end of it. Thayer watched her from the table without interrupting. When she finished, she handed him the string. "You said things are different now," she said, "so let's make it different." He hung the cranberries without fuss, then stepped back to look at the little tree. "Still needs something," he muttered. She opened the small drawer by the stove and pulled out a square of muslin. "You have time to carve one more thing?" He raised a brow. "What are you thinking?" "A star, for the top." He cut it from pine that evening, smoothing the corners by lantern light. She tied a loop of blue thread through it and placed it atop the tree herself. That night, as the wind pushed along the eaves, Savannah pulled her chair beside his. They sat close without touching, hands resting on their knees, the firelight painting their faces with gold. "Are you still waiting for me to change my mind?" she asked. Thayer didn't look away. "No, I stopped wondering that when you chose to stay." "I didn't just stay," she said. "I started over." He reached for her hand then, slow but sure, and laced their fingers together. "I never wanted to be rescued," she said. "That day in the church, I thought I was standing on the edge of something terrible, but now I think maybe it was the edge of something better. I didn't rescue you, Savannah. I just offered you something steadier to stand on." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he shifted just enough to rest his cheek against her hair. They stayed like that until the fire burned low. On Christmas morning, he gave her a pair of wool-lined gloves, the stitches uneven but tight. She gave him a scarf she'd knit from a roll of gray yarn tucked in the bottom of the crate Ruth had brought weeks ago. "Didn't know you could knit," he said, wrapping it around his neck. "I didn't either," she said, "but I figured it out." The new year came with a heavy storm that lasted 2 days. They spent it inside, reading aloud from the book of poetry, trading passages and laughter over stew and cornbread. When the sun returned, they stepped outside together, boots crunching over the snow crust. "Next year," Thayer said, "we'll add on a second room, might be useful if we ever have company." Savannah looked out over the frozen fields. "Or a cradle," he turned to her, surprise flickering across his face. "You're sure?" "I'm late, and it feels different this time." He stepped in close, his breath clouding the air. "You're not afraid?" She shook her head. "Not with you." He took her face in his hands, his gloves rough against her skin, and kissed her with a quiet reverence that made the world fall away. Spring came late, but the thaw was soft and full of promise. The garden rows were turned again, and Savannah planted wild peach pits from a neighbor's orchard, spacing each one with care. Thayer built a wooden frame for trailing beans, and they worked the soil side by side, sleeves rolled and backs bent to the task. In April, she felt the child stir for the first time. She pressed Thayer's hand to her belly, and his eyes lit with something wordless and vast. They built the cradle together from pine, sanded smooth and shaped with care. He carved a small flower into the headboard. She lined it with a wool blanket cut from her mother's old shawl. When the baby came in October, the labor was long, but Thayer never left her side. He held her hand through each wave of pain, whispered steady words when her strength faltered, and wept quietly when their daughter let out her first cry. They named her Leela Ruth. Savannah held her close that first night, watching the firelight flicker on the walls. Thayer sat beside them, his hand resting over both of theirs. "I never thought I'd have this," he said. Savannah looked at him, her eyes full and sure. "You didn't just have it, you made it." They raised Leela on the land carved by their own hands. Savannah taught her to plant by the signs of the moon, to read the clouds, to listen when the wind changed. Thayer showed her how to fix a broken gate, how to carve a spoon, how to be quiet enough to hear the deer move through the brush. They laughed often. They argued sometimes, but they listened. They worked. They grew, years passed, marked not in sorrow, but in seasons, each one bearing the shape of a life built with patience and deep roots. And when the first peach tree bloomed pale and pink by the river, Savannah stood beside it, her fingers laced in Thayer's, their daughter running ahead of them with a ribbon in her braid, and knew she had crossed not into ruin, but into the kind of love that holds. A love that stayed.